Welcome everyone to the 40 Acres Football Podcast. It's another big week. We come off last week in a huge win in the Lone Star Showdown, but it doesn't get any easier from here. Texas heading to Atlanta to take on the Georgia Bulldogs. Essentially a home game for Georgia. We've already seen this game play out once before, but now totally different stakes. A chance to take home the SEC crown and get a first round bye in the college football playoffs. So let's get right into it. Obviously, we normally start with the college football playoff rankings. We'll spend a little bit of time there. Fellas, do y'all have any glaring issues with the rankings this week?
Miami, I've seen a lot complaining on that, but you know what? They lost to an unranked Syracuse, so I can understand why they dropped to 12, but man, Alabama. Listen, we can act like we didn't see this team get destroyed 24 to 3. We can act like we didn't see this team get beaten by a Vanderbilt in Nashville. It's completely about the brand. If you can't see there's bias at this point, I mean, I don't know what else to tell you. They don't even try to hide it anymore. Obviously, we know that the committee loves the SEC, and to be fair, it is the best conference in football, bar none. I do believe that still. Not going to discount the SEC, of course, but Alabama being a three-loss team at a spot ahead of Miami. I understand Miami's strength of schedule is not necessarily insane, but they are 10-2, and I think they have reasonable concern for being upset that Alabama is ranked ahead of them because Alabama looks like they're pretty much locked in with the date in Notre Dame, right? At this point, going to South Bend. And are we too hopeful for Notre Dame? Are we not hopeful? This could be honestly a big win for Alabama and a good draw that they've had because, I mean, you're going against Notre Dame, a team that's not played really in conference play. They don't have to prove themselves in an extra game because they've scheduled already as being an independent. So my only issue really is just Alabama, nothing else really.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Alabama as well. And just touching on your point, Joe, with the success the Crimson Tide have had in the past decade and a half in the multiple national championships, I would understand if it's a little bit of reluctancy to leave Alabama out. Given I know this is the first time we're having a 12-team playoff. That makes sense because, what's that going to look like without Alabama in the top 12 teams? So the reluctancy to leave them out, if that's there, I understand where it's coming from. How about also, this is not really a rankings thing, but more of a seedings thing. SMU at the 8 seed. That is a little high, I'd say. I don't know how much better they are than Indiana or Boise State, but 8 in the rankings, best ACC team, and them having a bye in the college football playoffs. So it's just kind of crazy to think how this format works is you could be one of the worst teams of the 12 teams selected and you could still end up with a bye. Boise State and SMU being the 8 and 10 seeds, still better than the Big 12, and they're going to get byes. Meanwhile, you have Ohio State, Tennessee, potentially Georgia, and either Miami or Alabama playing in that first round game when not necessarily Miami, but a lot of those teams I just mentioned, you can make an argument that they're better than SMU.
I am probably going to talk about a lot of the things you guys just brought up. One of the big things that I think these rankings showed with Miami being ranked behind Alabama is it gives the committee some breathing room and it sets a precedent if SMU goes and loses in the ACC championship to move them out of the rankings and make sure Alabama gets that final spot. Because if SMU loses, Clemson gets that automatic bid, and SMU would then fall in that last spot for the playoffs instead of currently 11th ranked Alabama. With the committee ranking Miami behind Alabama, I think that opens the door for them to move SMU out of the playoff with a conference championship loss. Now,
Pitiful.
Ward Emanuel said on the college football selection or on the rankings release show that they're not going to move anybody that's not playing. But then after the selection show, he told people in a media availability that there could potentially be movement for teams that lose a conference championship. So I think we're setting up, if Clemson wins that ACC championship, for SMU to be moved out of the playoff to ensure that three-loss Alabama gets in.
And this goes back to the conversation that we heard a few days ago about someone pitching to Shane Beamer, I believe, in a press conference. Are guys going to start ducking the conference championship then? Because if you're not playing, you're just not going to move, right? But if you're losing, say if you're like SMU and you flat out get knocked to the bottom or potentially risk getting knocked out if you get absolutely pounded for the ACC championship, why do you even play the conference championship for an extra game just to have an auto bid? So it's just an odd thing that's going on so far. I do like this playoff system. I do think it's much more exciting than the four team in years prior, but I do think they have some things to clean up for sure in the future. And it's just interesting to watch develop because you have teams like Miami, which I see why they're so disgruntled. You have Lane Kiffin complaining from the outside. You've had Shane
By
Beamer
the way,
also complaining, huh?
by the way, I didn't mean to cut you off, but Ole Miss, per Warday Manual, what he said going on ESPN just a few days ago. So in Ole Miss's situation, they can't move up anymore, can they?
Correct. They cannot.
So they're officially not going to make it.
I would say they're officially out, yeah.
Interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's unfortunate because I think if this year had the top four-team playoff format, there's no controversy right now. The only controversy you would be seeing is if Georgia beats Texas, do two SEC teams make it, or do you move the loser out, right? And when you add the 12 team, the 1 year where it feels like there wouldn't be a whole lot of controversy if it was a four-team playoff, now all of a sudden there's there's a pretty big issue when those things come into play. I don't know. It's a really tough thing for the committee to try and figure out, but I do think that 12 teams in an expanded format is good for the sport.
Do you think this would have been a tougher conversation if Georgia had lost that game against Georgia Tech, or do you think it became easier since they were able to come away within eight OTs?
I think it became a lot easier. I think the committee was sweating bullets watching that game.
You think there's a reason why so many SEC teams now are losing three games? Like Bama has three losses. Ole Miss has got three losses. Is there a reason why the whole SEC is tearing each other up this year of all years? I have a hard time believing it's because Texas and OU are in the conference because Texas hasn't played a lot of those teams that have three losses and they don't usually lose that much.
Yeah, I don't think there's a huge explanation for it, to be honest. I think it's a weird, really weird year in the SEC.
I just don't
I,
know if there's. Yeah, go ahead.
This might, I was just gonna say, Jay, I don't know if this is gonna be precedent for future years to come, where all these teams are gonna eating each other alive, or if it's gonna go back to how it usually was. There's like usually two or three good SEC teams, and they don't drop fluke games, but we'll see.
We will see. And one of those games that we're going to find out a lot from is happening in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, Georgia, Texas versus Georgia, part two. Fellas, I have a couple questions because the game is important. At the same time, it feels like both of these teams are locked into the playoff. Does this game really matter?
Well, for morale, for perspective, if you want to be a national champion, absolutely. But if you're just looking to stay in the tournament, absolutely not. This game doesn't really matter like that. You want, if you're Texas, for a confidence perspective, you have to win this game if you're looking ahead to have a national championship. That's not to say they can't win it if they were to lose this game, but for a team that got embarrassed at home, who seemingly could not win a big game with all those recruits lined up on the sideline, similarly to 2 years ago with TCU coming to Austin, also couldn't do it there. This is a big game for this program to try to at least make their statement on the national and in the bigger scene, really. because people have the reputation towards them that they can't really get the job done when the lights are the brightest. And you saw it really in the Sugar Bowl against Washington, how this team was right there. And as Quinn Ewers was throwing that ball up high towards the corner against the Huskies, and that ball was just way overthrown. I'm sure that's haunted this team the entire offseason. They've been trying to chase to get back to not just that stadium, but finally have a chance to play for a championship. So for the Texas Longhorns, this game absolutely matters. I'm sure that Steve Sarkisian is just pushing his team to really take advantage of the opportunity at hand because I'm sure that the entire country, I shouldn't say the entire country, the entire SEC is probably not rooting for Texas here in their first year just to win a conference championship. Kind of makes the conference look a little bit weaker. The Texas season has already been so excellent, and people are already telling them that their strength of schedule was weak. They've really played no one. So you have a chance to really silence the naysayers. And if you're Steve Sarkisian, this is an opportunity that you have to just take advantage of.
I feel like I feel like Texas doubters really said they haven't played anyone before A&M, and that if Texas lost to A&M, people would have been like, see, there you go. Look what happens when you match up against a legit team and they lose. But the thing is, Texas didn't lose that game. They won that game, and we still hear Texas hasn't played anyone. Well, what about before when y'all were like, A&M's your first real matchup? Well, Texas beat A&M, and now y'all are still saying Texas hasn't played anyone. So it's a little confusing from the narrative perspective. I do, I'm surprised by what I'm about to say. I'm surprised by, but I understand. Is Georgia potentially being a three-loss team and being locked in for the playoffs? Now, it seems like of all the two-loss teams, they may be, and Ohio State, maybe Tennessee. But of all the two lost teams, those who will lose this, well, actually, I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. I'm gonna get to the point. Georgia is the only two lost team, I'm pretty sure, that plays this weekend. And with them losing potentially, and then there's still a lock for the playoff, that surprises me because I think the whole point of the 12-team playoff was the threshold of whether you're in or you're out is three losses, two losses you can get in, three losses you're out. And the fact that they could have three losses and still be a lock is pretty crazy to me. I do think they should go if they lose still. I still think they should go. I'm just surprised by it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the fact that we might have two three-loss SEC teams in the playoff versus no two-loss ACC teams in the playoff. It's pretty staggering, but I also think it's kind of justified. I don't think the ACC is a very strong conference, and I think we've seen that throughout the year. Miami looked fraudulent all season long, and that kind of came to fruition in the final week against Syracuse. And again, I think Syracuse is a solid football team, but I don't think they match up with a lot of those SEC teams. That being said, when I look at this game, obviously it's great to quell the naysayers and squash the talk around Texas, but I don't think winning this game is necessary for Texas. I think they have to be in this game. I don't think you can get physically dominated like they did earlier in the season at DKR, but I don't think Texas has to win this game. And Joe, you said it, it's great for morale purposes, but you also said that Texas could win the championship if they lose, and I really agree with that. Based on the path that we're looking at right now, if Texas were to win and the rankings were to stay the same, Texas would play the winner of Indiana and Georgia, potentially play Georgia for a third time, and I don't know if Texas necessarily wants to win this game and then play Georgia a third time. And obviously, you don't want to go into a game and say, let's lose to get a better draw. I think that backfires in almost every sport. We've seen it in the NBA, we've seen it in the NFL as well. But at the same time, it might give them an easier draw. And if you're Texas, do you kind of look into that? Do you play into that a little bit? I don't know. I don't think this game is must win, like a lot of other Texas fans believe. As long as Texas is in the playoff and has a chance to win it all at that point, I think they have one of the best rosters in the country and can do it from there.
It sure would be nice, though. I'll say that. Sure would be nice. And you know,
Absolutely.
Texas fans would, oh my goodness, they would rub it in to not only, A&M fans, but OU fans, fans who have been in the conference for decades and have never won the SEC championship. A lot of bragging rights could be at stake here, but like you were saying, this team is not necessarily like out of it. And maybe if they were to lose this game, this could be the spark that wakes them up to potentially go on a national championship run. So I'm kind of in the middle of it. I say like it matters from a morale standpoint, but you never really know in a playoff system. This is the first time for everybody. I mean, this is a system that we've seen typically in FCS ball, but knowing that it's finally making its debut here, I really do think it's any man's ball game for multiple teams. It's just a battle of who wants it more for 4 quarters. So we'll see how this goes.
I think Texas will definitely try to win this game. I think they really want to because of what they would get in the college football playoffs with that bye. And one thing, I think, yes, with the standings right now, Georgia could play Texas a third time, but I think that's because they have two losses, and that's what would happen if the playoffs ended right now. I don't think the committee was taking into account what it would be by the end of this week. And, what happens when this weekend slate of games happens and Texas wins? Georgia will be a three-loss team and likely dip a couple spots, and Texas would avoid the possibility of playing them a third time. I think with the way the bracket looks right now, I think that's just because it's literally like what I just said. It's because it's the season, it's the playoff, it's the standings at a glance right now. They put Georgia at 5 because they're 10-2. Georgia loses this game this weekend. Let's say Texas wins, then Georgia would no longer be at the 5 spot because they would be 10-3. So I think it's all just a matter of what is the current perspective. And I think things like that are very well set to change. Anything can happen this weekend. And then we talked about talking a little bit about, what could be the spark to bring Texas back. I think that spark is kind of on its way back because of what I saw in the A&M game. Yes, Quinn Ewers did not have at all a great second half with the two turnovers and then the miscommunication to Isaiah Bond at the end of the game, but he sure did have a great first half, and I think there's about probably 10 to 15 great plays he made versus two mistakes he made in the second half. And I think people are feeding the 10 to 15 plays he made in the first half that were really good. And that showed me more promise that, he's coming back now. And there's also the Arch Manning two quarterback system where they can throw him in on goal line stands and have him run it in. So I think that, like Stark said, they're opening up the playbook a little bit. And I think the Mojo's is, if it's not back yet, it's kind of on its way there.
I would agree. And I think that's a great segue into discussing some matchups for this week's game. What are some of the things y'all are looking for from a game plan perspective on both sides of the ball for Texas in this matchup?
I'm just looking for another matchup, mainly between play callers. Again, Steve Sarkisian against Greg Schumann. Greg Schumann, who's also been getting rumored to take another head coaching job, maybe North Carolina, some other calls he's getting. Kirby Smart's talked about how he's actually from McKinney North, believe it or not, DFW guy, Greg Schumann. His father was a coach, and so he's a grad assistant starting at Auburn, worked his way up, became defensive coordinator. Uh, this past season, but he's done a great job this year, Greg Schumann, and he just might become a head coach based on how this team finishes this year. You look at the game last time these teams face, Texas was a 4.5 point favorite in Austin. They still are a favorite in Atlanta, 2.5 points this time. But you look at how they got off the field last time. 2 of 15, they held Texas on third down. They had 13 tackles for loss. Quinn Ewers just looked absolutely lost out there in the field. He really didn't know where to go. It seemed like he had 8 guys coming after him every play, it seemed like almost. But, you have the interception that he threw later on. You have, of course, the penalties that Texas would draw, in total 8 on the game. And then I believe Texas also, I mean, they played well on the defensive side of the ball. But when you look at why they lost, it was because they gave the defense a short field. And that's why I believe they really gave up 30 points to Georgia. So I do think that the key is Steve Sarkisian keeping the ball on the ground, because actually Georgia only let up, I believe, 29 rush yards. Let me see
Hmm.
that if I got that right. 29 rush yards against um the Longhorns last matchup. So they stopped the run pretty well. But I do think that this offensive line has gotten better from that time. It depends on how Kelvin Banks is health-wise. He was healthy, of course, in that last game, but his status is still kind of up in the air for this week. We heard a few minutes ago that he did practice this week, so we'll see how he'll be for Saturday. But I think running the ball is essential if you're Steve Sarkisian against this defensive front for Georgia, who is stout. But we saw how they were last week against Georgia Tech. They can give up some yards on the run. We saw it with Haynes King. We saw it with the backfield in Georgia Tech. They're not invincible. They are a very beatable team. This should be, in my opinion, a way for Texas to get back on track and beat Georgia this time around.
Yeah, you just brought it up. The running game that Georgia Tech had against Georgia was really impressive, and I think it opens up a lot for what Texas can do offensively. Now, Robert, you brought up the two quarterback system. I think Sark is going to go to that a lot more in this game than he did in the last game versus Texas A&M. But I don't want Texas to fall into the trap of making Arch Manning a read option quarterback when he comes into the game. The threat of the pass has to be there because he is a different quarterback than your typical come in and run read option guy, right? He can actually sling that football around and put it in spots that most cannot. And so if Texas wants to run that system, I think the threat of the pass has to be there from an early situation in the game. Say you bring him in on third down, you look like you're running a read option, but it's actually a shot down the field or it's a crossing route over the middle. That's going to open up a lot more for Texas than just throwing him in there and forcing him to be a runner all the time. But I do think with the way the Texas running game has looked as of late, with Trey Wisner being just an absolute workhorse the last couple games, that they're going to be more effective on the ground, and that's going to open up more play action as well for Quinn to start slinging the rock around.
Yeah, I agree. For that two quarterback system, or excuse me, for Arch Manning to be a threat, I do agree that you have to utilize his passing asset, and because you can't just put Arch Manning in at the goal line every time and have the other teams just expect him to run it. You have to really put him in you really have to put him in if he's going to pass the ball at some point too. But that's where it gets interesting is because during the A&M game, we mainly only saw Arch come in when they were inside the red zone, probably inside about the 10-yard line, and we're going to be using Arch to scramble a little bit, not scramble, like run it up the middle, go for the first down. That's all about all he did. So in a normal game where Quinn Ewers is playing well or playing just fine enough to just is doing just fine, in Texas in the game in a situation like that, at what point does it make sense to put in Arch to utilize that passing threat? I see what you're saying. If they want to use the two quarterback system well, they need to utilize Arch Manning's passing threat and not just use him as an RPO. But then again, at what point does it make sense when Quinn's having a fine normal game and then you just want to randomly switch things up just so he could throw a ball?
Yeah, I think what makes the most sense, in my opinion, is if Texas is driving, they get past midfield, they're going quick, and then they want to switch up the tempo. You bring Arch in, but you don't just bring him in for one play. You leave him in there for a couple plays, maybe a series of downs. And I think that's going to open up the playbook and confuse the defense more than anything, rather than just bringing him in on a short yardage third down situation and expecting him to pick it up with his legs. I think you can do that. I think he's a talented enough runner. I think he's a talented enough quarterback to read the defense and understand what's going on. But I do think that Texas has to take a risk in leaving him in there for a series of downs and seeing what he can do without also taking Quinn out and jeopardizing that whole aspect of the offense.
It's
Definitely
an
agree.
interesting perspective. I mean, I think this is all just because of the injury, obviously. I don't know if I agree with keeping Arch in for an entire series. Um, his time will come. I do think that if you're Quinn Ewers, that obviously you're just a liability right now with your ankle. That's a little bit bummy. But as far as the game plan last week, I thought that was actually perfectly executed. Keep him in just every now and then. I don't think he has to be in there for 4 or 5 consecutive plays because say Quinn gets in the groove and he chucks the ball, a good few plays, converts first down after first down. I don't know if I always want to see him just come off the field and, ruin his like hot streak or something. And that's not saying that like he can't bounce back or anything. I don't believe that he can come back in and work back seamlessly. But I just, at this point in the season, I don't want him to be on the sidelines less if he's going to be our best chance to win a game, a big time game that Texas has been trying to win since '05, '06 in the Rose Bowl. I think that last week's game plan was just fine. It caught me off guard. We heard rumors of it all week long. I wasn't thinking they were actually going to do it. I thought it was a little bit crazy, a little bit crazy to talk about with Arch Manning coming in for plays at this point in the season, but it worked out, and we saw the reversal on that call going towards the left pylon, him diving. You saw his athleticism right there. They say he has tree trunk legs, and he broke that first tackle, and he's a strong runner, so I guess it can work really. But I don't know if I want to see him in there for whole series. His time will come.
And that's the thing, Joe, is I agree with that. Is in, like I said, the two plays in the second half that Quinn had, it was the pick and the fumble. I feel like that's overshadowing the groove that Quinn Ewers went into in the first half. Quite frankly, that first half performance, I know the Florida game was great. Florida game was great, but there were a lot of yards after catch uh that that was able to really boost Quinn's stats that game. In the A&M game, first half, that showed me the similar level of promise that Quinn did in the Michigan game. You know, Vanderbilt
He was
really,
dotted up out there. He was.
he, Quinn was scrambling on a limp ankle, but looking good. He didn't really seem like he was limping to me. And he was putting the ball in the right pockets. We saw his deep ball to Golden. We saw that really good pass to Ryan Wingo, put it in the right pocket. I mean, he connected it with Jaden Blue. He was doing all he could.
That
Yeah.
golden pass may be his best deep pass all year. I mean, it was just a thing of beauty. If you see Will
Had
Lee,
a couple of deep balls against A&M, to be honest,
yeah,
and that's been
yeah,
a
the one with Wingo, the crosser going over to
yep.
the other sideline, that was a great throw as well. The Jaden Blue throw in
And
the
what about the
back
Gunnar
corner,
Helm one?
Gunnar Helm
Where he's
one.
like stepping out of the pocket.
It was,
It was
I
it was
put that more on the inept
he's
defensive.
scrambling out of the pocket a little bit, and he's got this awareness of where the line of scrimmage is, and he's kind of able to
Are we
just
talking about the one that almost got picked, or are you talking about the other one that was like
no,
sort of
no, no,
beauty?
not the one that almost got picked. I forgot
Oh,
about
okay,
that one,
okay,
but the
okay,
one where
okay.
Helm catches it and hurdles someone.
Okay, okay.
Pump
That was a
fake.
good play. That was a good play. Okay.
That was
I
nasty.
misunderstood you.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah. I think one other matchup that I'm looking forward to is how does this Texas pass rush get after the quarterback and Carson Beck? Trey Moore, when Georgia and Texas last played, it felt like Trey Moore hadn't really found his role in this defense. As of late, he has been phenomenal. We saw him force the fumble on Marcel Reed to close out the game that was recovered by Vernon Broughton. And then obviously Colin Simmons, Anthony Hill, Vernon Broughton's performance as of late. This Texas D line, and in particular Trey Moore, I think is going to have a much bigger impact on this game than what they did earlier in the season against Georgia. It felt like they were held under wraps for the most part in that earlier match.
Yeah, and look, I believe they showed in the broadcast in College Station it was like 20 something straight games with a turnover for this Texas defense. I think it was like 23 or 24, and it extended, of course, after that Michael Taft interception, a very beautiful interception that was from the former walk-on. But you look at Pete Kwiatkowski's defense. I'm done questioning Pete Kwiatkowski. There was a time I was a little bit more critical of him about 2 years ago. But when I look at this defense, they know how to get off the field. And Josh Pate was saying it a few days ago. This offense for Texas necessarily doesn't have to play, um, I guess, an elite style to win a game because this defense keeps them in every single ball game for the most part. And like I was saying a few minutes ago, Georgia scored 30 because they had a short field.
Hmm.
So the story of this game is going to be if the offense can protect the ball and just flat out move the chains. Because when the Texas defense had a fair shot, they were able to get turnovers. I mean, they had a turnover turnover with their backs against the wall also in that first quarter against Carson Beck. So I think they'll find a way to get the ball because they have a lot of ball hawks on that defensive side of the ball, especially in the defensive secondary. But I do think for this defense that they just have to find a way to get off the field, and they have to find a way to take control of this game because Texas has been leaning on them the entire year. Ironic when your head coach and main play caller is, known as offensive genius. So they kind of have a little bit of spotty and inconsistent year offensively. But defense has just been stellar this year, and I think that Texas can trust them yet again in this game.
For sure. For sure. I with all those great points that you both brought up, I think we know what time it is, and that's prediction time. Give me some scores.
After you, Robert.
Yeah, so it's either I'm very just reminiscent of the Big 12 championship last year and the kind of the shootout that was, or I'm just I'm just about to fire a really, really bizarre prediction. But I think this is going to be high scoring for both teams. I don't think the deficit between both teams is going to be that big. I think it'll be a close game. I do think it'll be high scoring compared to last game. Yeah. Give me we're gonna go 38 to 34 Texas.
Wow. Wow. Shootout. I was really thinking the complete opposite. I think it's going to be a defensive game. I think it's going to be pretty low scoring. Not as low scoring as the game we saw last week in College Station. I think this game can be a rebound for Texas. They win the SEC championship. I'm going to go with about 24-21, Bert Auburn, a game-winning field goal in Georgia territory. He finds a way, just finds a way to knock it through the uprights when the team needs him the most. Of course, the field goal is under 50 yards because if it was over 50 yards, it might be a little problematic for Big Red. But I do think that Texas finds a way to play a great defensive game yet again, and the offense does just what they need to do. They run the ball in the first half, they can score points, but in the second half, the Georgia defense finds a way to make a few adjustments and pressure Quinn Ewers and try to claw their way back. I think this game is going to be very close, low scoring. I anticipate a turnover each by both teams, and we'll just see how this goes. It's going to be a great one in Atlanta.
I'm kind of split in the middle of y'all. I think there's going to be more than one turnover on each side, and I think teams are going to capitalize on those turnovers. Robert, I think your score is a little too high for what I'm going to go for, but I do think it's going to be somewhat of a shootout, a barn burner, if you will. I'm going to go 31 to 26. I think Texas pulls it out in this game. I really believe that Texas had a chance, even in this last matchup, to get back into the game and even win that game if they cleaned up just a few mistakes. And I think they're going to clean up those mistakes. They're going to make a couple as well, but I don't think they're going to be as costly. I don't think Texas is going to turn the ball over in minus territory and give Georgia short fields. Um, and I think that's going to be really the biggest key. So I'm going to go Texas 31, Georgia 26. But all of us are picking Texas, so you know we can look really stupid next week.
Well, and to your point, I mean, you were talking about how that game was closer than people give it credit for until the fourth quarter. I mean, going into, I believe, the middle of that fourth quarter, it was 23-15, and then eventually Georgia would punch it in from fourth and goal, like at the half-yard line. It was a crazy stand that defense almost end up making for the Longhorns, but they punched it in eventually on the ground. It was a close game for a good amount, so I don't consider that game necessarily a blowout. It looks bad from the ending score, but I think it's anybody's ball game here. I do think Texas comes away with it.
I think obviously there are a lot of mistakes in the first half when they last played in October, but I think Texas lost the game when the defense gave up the first down and that third down in the third quarter. Back when Texas was down maybe by a touchdown. What was it? The score was maybe 22 to 15. Yeah. And then there was like a third and 10 that they gave up. I think that's where Georgia kind of stole the momentum because they went down the field and scored. But even with Texas coming into that game 6-0 and them kind of barely winning a few of these games in the past weeks. Not barely winning, but not looking as crisp. I still, for some odd reason, just feel like they're playing a lot better heading into this game than that when they were going into the first game matchup. I know that's kind of a crazy take, but I don't know. I really liked what I saw from the offense in the A&M game in the first half.
Yeah, me too. And if Texas can build on that, I think it's going to be really tough to stop them going forward. We all know that about that defense, but if the offense gets going and can be consistent throughout a full game, they're going to be tough to stop. And I think that can separate them from a couple of other teams in the field. That being said, Robert, Joe, thanks for joining us. As always, we appreciate y'all for listening. We got a huge game this weekend. Texas, Georgia, SEC championship, a chance to bring home the trophy in the first year in the conference. For the 40 Acres Football Podcast, that's going to be all today. We'll see y'all next week whenever the rankings are official and we know Texas's path to a potential national championship. Thanks and have a good night.